Hello everybody, thank you for watching. My name is Don. I want to speak about what I believe is some clues in the book of Maccabees, which is cut out of the Bible and kept secret by the Vatican, because it gives clues of how the Antichrist will be like, and probably where he will come from in the book of Maccabees. But before then, how we come to that. It's chapter 8 of Daniel, which says, this is Daniel's prophecy: "When I raised my eyes, then I saw, and look, a ram standing before the watercourse, and it had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were tall, but the one was taller than the other, and the taller one was the one that came up afterwards. And I saw the ram making thrusts to the west and to the north and to the south, and no wild beast kept standing before it, and there was no one doing any delivering out of the hands, and it did according to its will, and it put on great airs. And I, for my part, kept on considering, and look, there was a male of the goats coming from the sunset upon the surface of the whole earth, and it was not touching the earth. And as regards the he-goats, there was a conspicuous horn between its eyes, and it kept coming all the way to the ram possessing the 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the watercourse, and it came running towards it in a powerful rage, and I saw it coming into close touch with the ram, and it began showing bitterness towards it, and it proceeded to strike down the ram and to break its 2 horns, and there proved to be no power in the ram and to stand before it. So it threw it to the earth and trampled it down, and the ram proved to have no deliverer out of its hands." And the angel Gabriel gave Daniel the meaning to this in the next chapter 8, verse 20. "The ram that you saw possessing the 2 horns stands for Medes and Persia, and the hairy he-goat stands for the king of Greece, and for the great horn that was between its eyes, it stands for the first king." And it says here, and the first king was Alexander the Great, and it goes on to say, and also when Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, when Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, his great empire, which stretched from Greece all the way to India, had to be split up. And it says here in verse 22 of chapter 8 of Daniel, "And at that one having been broken, so that there were 4 that finally stood up instead of it. There are 4 kingdoms from his nation, and that will stand up, but not with his power." So in other words, when he died, Alexander the Great, no heirs of Alexander the Great was left, because they were actually murdered. His son was murdered, Alexander the Fourth, by his generals, including, that's the direct heir from Alexander the Great, and even his wife, Roxana, was killed as well. So it was split up with 4 generals. Cassandra, which ended up Macedonia and Greece, controlling that, because they couldn't. They split up into 4. So Cassandra, Ptolemy, which became ruled Egypt. So that you got the Ptolemaic pharaohs, which had Macedonian blood in it, and Lysimaeus, they ruled Thrace or Bulgaria and Turkey today, and Seleucid, which rules Syria, and that is the most important one that I will deal with, which will lead on to Book of Maccabees, which says this in verse 8 of chapter 8 of Daniel, and the male of the goats for its part put on great airs to the extreme. But as soon as it became mighty, the great horn was broken, as I said, Alexander the Great. They proceeded to come up conspicuously four instead of it, towards the four winds of the heaven. So they split into four, and it says it, verse 9, out of one of them there came forth another horn, a small one, and it kept getting very much greater towards the south and towards the sunrise and towards the decoration. And it kept on getting greater all the way to the army of the heavens. See, this small horn, and it says there, came from one of these four. And I found out, done some research, that this little horn was from the Seleucid general who became a ruler of Syria. And it's from here that I will read MACCABEES, Antiochus IV come from, the evil Syrian king that is an Antichrist foreshadow. So I'm reading from the book of MACCABEES, which is, as I said, a lost book of the Bible. Right, so leaving off from chapter 1 of the first book of Maccabees, verse 5. When Alexander had been emperor for 12 years, he fell ill, as Alexander the Great, and realized that he was about to die. He called together his generals, noblemen who had been brought up with him since his early childhood, and divided his empire, giving a part to each of them. After his death, himself crowned king of his own territory. The descendants of the king ruled for many generations and brought a great deal of misery on the world. In particular, this little horn that breaks away from one of the generals, Seleucid, as one of the generals. This is in verse 10, the wicked ruler Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus III of Syria, was descendants of one of Alexander the Great's general, Antiochus Epiphanes. So he was a descendant of one of Alexander the Great's general, and he brought a lot of misery to the world, especially to the Jews, which I'm going to read on. This is here. Antiochus Epiphanes had been a hostage of Rome before he had become king of Syria in the year 137. And I'm jumping down to verse 16 of chapter 1 of Maccabees. Antiochus attacks Egypt. When Antiochus had firmly established himself as king, as Antiochus of Epiphanes the fourth, he decided to conquer Egypt and rule that country as well as Syria. He invaded Egypt with a large fleet of ships and a powerful army, including chariots, elephants, cavalry. When the attack came, King Ptolemy of Egypt turned and fled. So he beat Egypt, making King Ptolemy of Egypt run away, the pharaoh at the time. So he captured not only Syria but Egypt. But that wasn't enough. Antiochus was able to capture and the fortified cities of Egypt and plunder the whole land. But now he wanted more. He was turning his attention to the Jews. Verse 20. In the year 143, after the conquest of Egypt, Antiochus marched with a great army against the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. In his arrogance, he entered the temple. This is, I believe, Antiochus of Epiphanes is a foreshadow of the Antichrist to come. That's what he does. In his arrogance, he enters the temple in Israel and took away the gold altar, the lampstand, and all its equipment. Can you imagine all the sacred utensils, altar, lampstand, etc. The table with the bread offered to the Lord. He took away the cups and the bowls, the gold fire pans, the curtain and the crowns. He also stripped all the gold from the front of the temple and carried off the silver and the gold and everything else of value, including all the treasure that he could find stored there. He then, if that wasn't enough, then he took it all to his own country. He also murdered many people and boasted arrogantly about it. There was a great mourning everywhere in the land of Israel. Rulers and leaders groaned in sorrow. Young men and young women grew weak. He goes on to say, 2 years later, Antiochus sent a large army from Mysia. If that wasn't enough, Jerusalem, 2 years later, he told them to go against the towns of Judea. When the soldiers entered Jerusalem, their commander spoke to the people, offering them terms of peace, but he completely deceived them. See, he lied about, offering peace, but it was just a deception. Then he suddenly, after deceiving them, saying it was just, let's have peace, he launched a surprise attack, launched a fierce attack on the city, dealing a major blow and killing many people. He plundered the city, set it on fire, and tore down the buildings and the walls of Jerusalem. Can you imagine that? He destroyed everything. He and his army took the women and the children as prisoners and seized the cattle. Then Antiochus and his forces built high walls and strong towers in the area north of the temple, turning it into forts. Can you imagine that? He built high walls and strong towers in the area north of the temple, turning it into a fort. They brought in a group of traitorous Jews and installed them there. They also brought in arms and supplies and stored in the forts all the loot that they had taken in Jerusalem. This fort became a great threat to the city. The forts was a threat to the temple, a constant evil menace for Israel. Innocent people were murdered around the altar. The holy place was defiled by murderers. Can you imagine the holy mountain and the temple and altar were defiled by murderers? The people of Jerusalem fled in fear, and that city became a colony of foreigners. Jerusalem was foreign to its own people, who had been forced to abandon the city. Her temple was empty as a wilderness. Her festivals were turned into days of mourning. Her Sabbath joy into shame. Her honour became an object of ridicule. Her shame was as great as her former glory, and her pride was turned into deep mourning. This is it. Carries on. If that wasn't bad enough, Antiochus now issued a decree that all the nations in his empire should abandon their own customs and become one people. All the Gentiles and even many of the Israelites submitted to this decree. They adopted the official pagan religion. That is, I think, is the Roman religion or Greek religion that they had prior, because they were from Greece originally, with all these false pagan gods. They offered sacrifices to idols and no longer observed the Sabbath. The king also sent messengers with a decree to Jerusalem and to all the towns of Judea, ordering the people to follow customs that were foreign to the country. He ordered them not to offer burnt sacrifice or offerings, grain offerings or wine offerings to the temple. So he told them to stop, and commanded them to treat Sabbaths and festivals as an ordinary working day. They were even ordered to defile the temple and the holy things in it. They were commanded to build pagan altars, temples and shrines, and to sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals there. This will be there's going to be a second part to this, so please, if you can, check out my second part, which I will continue and read on a bit more. If you haven't come to know Christ, please come to know Christ, because he is the way, the truth and life, and only through him we can gain salvation. Please, I'll read more of this so it gives you an idea how the Antichrist will be like using the book of Maccabees. Thank you. Please check out my second part. Thanks. Bye.